In this chapter, we're going to be talking about disorders of childhood. Now, some of these continue into adulthood, so technically they are disorders first evident in childhood. A large category of these disorders involve neurological problems during developmental stages, so we call them neurodevelopmental. And others represent disruptive behavior well beyond what you normally see in children. Children can be a challenge, and sometimes they're disruptive, even if they're basically healthy and normal, and will turn out to be great adults. The neurodevelopmental problems typically involve neurological processes that affect learning, memory, and a variety of other behaviors. In contrast, the disruptive, which are usually impulse control disorders, lead to problems in the behavior that are severe enough that they make normal processes like going to school or living within a family very difficult. The problem with studying children is that they are a moving target. I'm a licensed therapist, at least licensed in the state of New York. I'm not licensed in the state of Ohio, but I've never worked with children. And I don't work with children because I'm not a specialist in development. And in my mind, if you don't understand development very well, you shouldn't be working with children, because a 4-year-old is very different than a 6-year-old. And if you don't understand those differences, you're not going to function very well. I always describe it this way. Children are not just little adults. They are entirely different creatures. These next few slides will illustrate that moving target problem. You've got an infant, able to eat and do a little bit, but not a whole lot. And then a toddler who can get around. And then you have preschoolers who are starting to think for themselves, with some of their thought processes are pretty primitive. And young grade school children who are starting to develop cognitively and socially. And they're starting to become more complex people with personalities all their own. And by late grade school, you're starting to get some fairly sophisticated thinking. Not quite adult thinking, but getting there. In high school, you're getting closer to the level of thought processes that are typical of adults. By late high school, you're starting to develop the kind of social relationships that are closer to what you find in adults. And often, your success in those relationships by high school is a pretty good predictor of how well you will do as an adult. Certainly as a young adult, and most of you in this class would be in that category. You have many of the features typical of adults. Now, that doesn't mean you're going to stop changing. You'll continue to change throughout your entire life. But think of how far you've come in perhaps 20 years from an infant to who you are right now. And all the stages that you had to go through, and what might have happened if any of those changes were disrupted. So as I said, we can't even think of disorders of childhood without taking into account the normal developmental processes. One, conditions such as depression look different in children than they do in adults, because children are different. Two, anything that disrupts a child is not only going to create symptoms, but it's going to prevent them from the normal developmental course that would be going on, and probably leave some scars as a result. Now, as I mentioned, many disorders that start in childhood will continue to have effects well into adulthood. So in most cases, we are not talking about childhood disorders, but rather disorders that start there. The first topic we're going to talk about is called intellectual disability. Now, we used to call it mental retardation. The name has been changed, and I will talk about why in just a minute. Prior to mental retardation, which had several levels, mild, moderate, severe, and profound, we had labels for each of those levels of mental retardation: idiot, imbecile, and moron. Now the problem is those terms were used by the Three Stooges. You can still see Three Stooges short movies now on television periodically in reruns as insults that every second grader hurled at every other second grader out on the playground, if not actually in the classroom. And the reason why mental retardation was changed to intellectual disability is that those same second graders, not exposed to the words idiot, imbecile, and moron because they probably hadn't seen many Three Stooges movies, were calling other second graders retards. I'm sorry. Second graders insult other second graders, and it will not take them long to find some nickname for intellectual disability. That is part of the problem associated with this course. There is stigma associated with many of the disorders that we're covering, and that stigma leads to abusive behavior by some people. I wish there was some magic wand that would make second graders less cruel, but some second graders will probably always be cruel. We define intellectual disability not just by intelligence, which we can measure with an IQ test, but also by functional and social deficits. So if you have someone with an IQ of 68, which is in the mild mental retardation category, we don't define them just by the IQ. If they have an IQ of 68, but they are able to handle social situations, they have social relationships, they may even be married and raising children, so they're able to function, then by definition, they do not have intellectual disability. It's not just IQ. It has to be deficits and things other than IQ before the diagnosis is applied. Again, we have the same levels: mild, moderate, severe, and profound, and I'll talk about each in just a moment. Mild intellectual disability is by far the most common. It affects about 2% of the population. These individuals often can do reasonably well in school, although not as good as many of their peers. But they can learn to read, they can learn to write, they can learn to do basic arithmetic, they can learn things like social studies and apply them, etc. A long time ago, 60 or 70 years ago, we would refer to this group as educable. I'm not even sure that's a word, but you know what it means. It means they can be educated. And typically then what we would try to do is educate them as best we could. Now we're able to do actually fairly well with special education programs, but also trying to mainstream them as much as possible. So they're part of the school, they have the social experiences of other students, because again, remember, intellectual dysfunction is not just defined by how well you do in school, but also other deficits. Moderate intellectual dysfunction is much less common, only 1 person in 400. We used to have a term for them. We called them trainable, which was to say, well, we couldn't educate them in things like reading, writing, and arithmetic, but we could teach them to take care of themselves and teach them to do some basic things that, for example, might be employable, like janitorial service, for example. We now know that we can educate them. It's harder than educating people with higher IQs, requires more precision and more effort, but it can be done. And again, if you can read and write, a lot more of the world opens up to you than if you can't learn to read and write. These individuals may need some continued supervision, but many of them can live fairly independent lives with just a little bit of support. By the time we get to severe and profound, we are talking about deficits that really do affect the individual. One person in 1,000 will have the diagnosis of severe intellectual dysfunction. And typically, they will have difficulty communicating with other people. It's rare that they would ever learn to read or write. They may be able to do some basic skills. They may be able to take care of themselves, but even there, they require a bit of supervision. With proper support, they can live in a community setting, a group home, for example, but they will require support. Even basic things will have to be done for them, or they'll need a lot of support in it. Profound intellectual disability is fortunately very rare, affecting only 1 in 3,000 people. These people not only have severe intellectual and deficits in all kinds of behaviors, they usually have severe physical problems as well, often life-threatening physical problems. They cannot take care of themselves. They may not even be able to put their clothes on without help or even feed themselves. These are people that often require institutionalization. Even now, there was a time in which we institutionalized most people with intellectual dysfunction. We don't do that anymore. But the profoundly intellectually disabled individual probably needs so much help 24/7 that institutionalization is necessary. Let's talk about some of the causes and or contributing factors to intellectual disability. Chromosomal abnormalities account for some disorders, things like Down syndrome. In Down syndrome, a full chromosome, which contains a large number of genes, instead of having 2 copies, you have 3 copies. If you want to win a trivia contest, it's chromosome 21 that has 3 instead of 2 copies. Now, if you've ever met someone with Down syndrome, you probably were impressed by the fact that, God, they're fun to be around. They're wonderful people. They're happy people, which is saying a lot because Down syndrome has a lot of physical problems. Most people with Down syndrome used to die by the age of 5 because of congenital heart problems. Now we can correct that. They used to die from more complex medical problems by their late teens. We can manage or control those. So you're going to discover later, they now tend to die of Alzheimer's, usually in their 40s, that we can't control. Fragile X is another chromosomal abnormality. The difference between a chromosomal abnormality, which includes an entire chromosome and not individual genes, and a genetic abnormality is that a genetic abnormality is a result of an individual gene. PKU, for example. Phenylketonuria is the diagnostic term. It's due to a recessive gene. And if you have 2 copies of that recessive gene, you will develop severe, sometimes even profound, mental retardation. But you'll also develop a lot of other problems as well. What's happening in that case is that a particular chemical that is found in lots of foods will build up in your system to toxic levels because you don't have the enzyme to break it down. That chemical is called phenylalanine. What you can do if you have these genes is you can prevent that buildup by having your children with 2 copies of the gene on very special diets that are very low in phenylalanine. And as a result, they don't reach toxic levels, so there's less damage. Now, it's very hard to do. It's very hard to have a 4-year-old stay on a diet because every time they visit kids across the way, there's going to be things to tempt them that'll probably have phenylalanine in them. There are also half a dozen, fortunately very rare genetic conditions that lead usually to severe or profound intellectual dysfunction. I want to make a point here. The severe or profound intellectual dysfunction often accompanies a variety of other physical disorders because invariably it is the result of some severe process, either chromosomal or genetic, and therefore is affecting all kinds of processes in the body. We talked about Down syndrome. The chance of Down syndrome in your child increases as you age. Now, maternal age has the strongest relationship, but to a certain degree, paternal age does as well, because you've got 3 copies of a chromosome there, which could come from either the male or the female. This is the risk for Down syndrome at various ages of the mother during the pregnancy. What you can see is it's very low, but it starts to rise at about age 35 and rises rather quickly. It's still quite low, about 1/10% at age 40, but it is almost at 1% by the time you reach age 50 or 55. And typically after that, the woman is no longer fertile, no longer has periods, no longer can have babies. Usually after 40, doctors will tell the potential mother about the risks. If the parents are comfortable aborting a fetus, you can find out if the child has Down syndrome and then make that decision. Not everyone is. I had a very close friend. She was my editor for a textbook that I still do. She got pregnant about 42. She and her husband talked extensively, and they decided there was no way that they could in good conscience abort their child, so they'd never had the test. And I remember talking with her, and her philosophy was, no matter how the child turns out, I'm going to love that child, and I'm going to do my best to raise that child. So it turned out the child was beautiful and smart. Last I talked with her was just about to graduate with highest honors from college. Pregnancy and birth complications can definitely contribute to a variety of intellectual deficits. We know that there's risk of drug and alcohol consumption affecting the child in utero, and some of those effects will continue. We actually talked about one, the fetal alcohol syndrome, earlier in this course. We don't know exactly how much that risk is. Some people have argued that a drink once a day is not going to produce a risk. But the truth is we're never going to find out. And the reason we're never going to find out is the fact that we know there is some risk means it's now unethical to do any formal studies. Imagine taking a pregnant woman and say, okay, I want you to drink X amount because I want to see if your child is going to be born with fetal alcohol syndrome. She's probably not going to agree, and it's unethical to even put her in a position of asking. Same is true for other drugs as well. We know that infection, for example, syphilis or rubella, German measles, if the mother gets infected during pregnancy, there will be serious effects on the child if it's not treated quickly. Anoxia during delivery, we've already talked about that with respect to schizophrenia. It doesn't cause schizophrenia, but it's an added stress to brain development, and therefore if you're at risk for schizophrenia, it might increase slightly that risk. If the anoxia is severe enough, it will do brain damage. And of course, intellectual functioning. In fact, all functioning is the result of brain functioning. So if there's significant damage from anoxia, don't be surprised, there'll be severe intellectual deficits. Toxins also affect brain development, and younger children in particular, and children in utero, are very susceptible to toxins. The most common and ubiquitous toxin in our environment is lead. And one of the reasons it's common is that 50 years ago, most paint had lead in it. Now, for most of the last 50 years, leaded-based paints have been fairly rare. But a lot of older homes have paint like this with several layers, and the bottom layer or two has paint. When the paint peels off, which it eventually does, and falls down, it can get into the groundwater. And also, children often put things in their mouth, including pieces of paint like this. Old water pipes were often sealed with lead. Now, what happens over time is that deposits seal that lead so the water goes through without picking up the lead. But every time an old pipe breaks in an older city, with water pipes that go back 100 years or more, sand gets pushed through, and that's like sandpaper. It takes the film that is developed and protected the water from the lead that's either in the seal or sometimes in the pipes themselves. And now that lead is being absorbed. Again, it doesn't have a lot of effect on older people, but it has more of an effect on a child because the child's more susceptible to such toxins. Mercury is even more toxic. Fortunately, mercury is relatively rare in the environments. We tend to see it only around chemical factories that use mercury extensively in their process. By far, the most important contributor to intellectual dysfunction is the fact that intelligence, as measured by an IQ, is roughly normally distributed. Most of us are in the middle range. Roughly 95% are between 70 and 130 IQ. 95%. But about 2% are below 70 in a normal distribution. Now, they've done nothing wrong. Their combination of genes or influences in the womb, etc., is such that they're at the bottom of the distribution. There's always people at the bottom of every distribution. There are always people that are shorter than most other people, that are less intelligent, that are less athletic. If they are low enough, and if they have deficits other than intellectual deficits, they may qualify for the diagnosis of intellectual dysfunction. They almost never have other factors that create the severe forms of intellectual dysfunction that we've been talking about, like chromosomal or genetic abnormalities. Now, with respect to this, I want to talk about a concept that is horribly misunderstood, called heritability. Heritability is defined, and the words here are very important, as the proportion of variability currently in the variable that is due to variability in the genes. Okay, I'm choosing my words carefully. You're probably thinking, I don't see the problem here. That seemed pretty straightforward. Let me show you the problem. Why do we have two legs? Why are we almost always born with two legs? Well, it's because our genes provide a template for growing our bodies, and the normal thing is for us to be born with two legs and two arms and two eyes. Okay, just obviously genetically determined. So what is the heritability for the characteristic of the number of legs? You'd think it'd be 1 because genes account for it. But the heritability is actually near 0. What? We have 2 legs because of our genes, so it's got to be 1. No. Heritability is defined as the proportion of variability due to variability in genes. There's no variability in genes for the number of legs. Virtually everyone is born with 2 legs. And when they are not, it's usually not genes, but some chemical that the mother took during pregnancy that resulted in it. That's an environmental thing. People who don't have 2 legs may have had an encounter in war with an IED that blew off their legs, or with a traffic accident where they lost 1 or both legs. Those are environmental events. So almost all people who do not have 2 legs do not have 2 legs, not because of genes, but because of the environment. The other thing about heritability, and this is very important, is the assumption is that if the heritability is very high, you can't do anything about it because it's caused by genes. And that's simply not true. You can have very high heritability, as you do with PKU, for example. But if you have an environmental manipulation, such as a special diet for these children, you can overcome those genes. There is absolutely nothing in high heritability that says that you can't modify the traits with environmental interventions. We used to think that we could only educate people with mild mental retardation. We called them educable, but now we know we can educate people with moderate mental retardation. We used to think that was impossible, but now we know how to do it. Almost always the severe forms are not cultural or familial, but are the result of some severe problem with usually genetic material, either chromosomes or genes. I want to focus our attention for a moment on treatment, but I want to do it within a historical context. Before 1900, clearly intellectual dysfunction, mental retardation existed. Sometimes it was severe or profound, and in most cases, those individuals died of medical problems very young, often before age 1. And they were taken care of by their family as well as they could until the time that they died. And it was a tragic loss, but it was understood. Those with mild and sometimes moderate mental retardation typically survived, and they tended to live with their family, and they were taken care of by their family, and they contributed because, well, at that time, most families lived on farms or had family businesses. And so people with low intellectual functioning would do whatever they could within the family. And they would be taken care of by the parents, and then maybe after the parents died by, say, an older sibling. In the 19th century, late in the 19th century, we started to study more, and we suspected that we could help people with the proper institutional care who had intellectual dysfunction. So we created institutions for the mentally retarded. There are a few of those still around, but not very many. They're a lot like the orphanages that were popular in the 40s and early 50s. They're essentially no longer there. What happened is a terrible tragedy because people that managed to function fairly well in a home environment with reasonable support started functioning less and less well in an institutional setting. Now, the institutional settings brought together a lot of people with severe and profound mental retardation. Doctors were able to work with them. We became more skilled in helping those individuals to survive, but not more skilled in helping them to prosper in terms of intellectual and other functioning. Those institutions now are rare. They tend to take care of profoundly intellectually disabled individuals who need 24/7. In fact, they rarely are independent institutions. They will be a single ward, usually in some other hospital setting. Instead, what we do is, whenever possible, the individual is raised by their family and cared by their family. And if for some reason that's not possible, or the family does not want to do that, we typically will use group homes to provide a place to live. Those are supportive environments where the individual is able to have reasonable autonomy, but also they take care of the basic needs. But you also need programs during the day. Those are called rehabilitation, and those have been developed like day hospitals or sheltered workshops. Sheltered workshops are particularly interesting. In most states, they are not subject to minimum wage laws. So the individual will earn whatever it is that they can earn through their own productivity. And many companies, which do 95 or 99% of their products through automation, will give jobs to sheltered workshops and pay them the same amount that it would cost to do it with automation, but represents meaningful work for individuals who are intellectually disabled. So it might be things like putting together 8 hooks for draperies in a package that will be sealed and sold like any other package. Normally that's done by a machine. In the workshop, it'll be done by having an egg carton with 4 of the eggs cut off. So what you do is you put 1 hook in each one, and then you drop it into a container that funnels it into a bag, and then the bags are sealed. Now, it's a very inefficient process, and therefore the individual doesn't make a lot of money, but they do get paid. And getting paid is important. It doesn't matter what your IQ is, because it's your money, and you earned it, and you get to spend it any way you want. You can spend it going to the movies. Okay, you might not go on a Saturday night because it costs more. Maybe you'll go on a Tuesday afternoon at 2 o'clock because they have a bargain rate that you can afford, but you get to choose. And that does a lot for the morale and the psychological well-being of the individual. Special education is very important for those in the school system. And we now know that many of the people that we thought couldn't function in a school system can, with the right kind of support. And they can learn things that we previously thought that they could not do. The more intellectual skills that people learn, the better they're going to be able to function in society. Now, I know a lot of people in high school say, oh, I'll never use this, it's completely worthless. And then they find out years later that, okay, they should have learned it because they sort of need it and didn't realize that they would. Any kind of math skills, any kind of writing and reading skills, those kinds of things will serve you for your entire life. And since the world is changing so fast, we can't even predict which skills are going to be most important in the future.